Hi, everybody. Week 6 is done, and so I'm going to just raise a few points about that. Thanks to Vicky and Maria for their moderation of this week's discussion. We had a very wide-ranging discussion, actually, from details about how teachers can use various online technologies for language learning to imagining sort of future scenarios where students can connect to classrooms of interest sort of directly around the globe. Um, And I'm in terms of, there was also some discussion about teacher professional learning, which is obviously is a big part of any considerations about teaching in these environments. And I think both teacher professional learning and also collaborative learning among students, it takes a lot of exposure and time to learn how to do this well, because it's a very different model than our traditional educational model, and so which is very individualized, right, and very individualistic, and has always been that way. So this is it's a deep shift that's happening, and it's quite slow. So, but I think group and peer and collective approaches to developing teaching strategies, integrating new technologies is really the way to go. I think that's what we have to do at this time when there isn't really, such clear delineation. And there was discussion about, resistance issues. Well, and I think teachers will always resist the things that they don't feel fully sort of engaged by and fully understand. So, I mean, and there's a bit of a thing about blaming teachers who are not kind of jumping on technology. And I think it's unfortunate because it doesn't help sort of labeling people as resistant. So I think, you have to really work to understand what it is that's difficult for them. What is it that they are fundamentally having challenges with? And then work with them to try to undo that. But that's as opposed to just sort of labeling. They get labeled. I think people get labeled in this situation. I think people are just much more likely to try new things if they feel supported and heard, and if they see a clear instructional or learning benefit for implementing a change. But it's hard to envisage that benefit when it involves a lot of preparation, extra preparation for an outcome you're not really sure about in the first place. So, and I think that's the job of teacher professional development, whether it's with peers or even thinking about it from a board or a school level. I also talked a bit about the medium as making it more complex in terms of understanding online issues. So, if you take online discussion, we have collaborative interactions which are recorded and available for review and for revision and for improvement. And because we have this asynchronous environment, that allows for those differences. But it's a very different kind of thing when you do. Well, what I want to pose as something to consider is that online synchronous video conferencing, is that the same as classroom-based collaborative interaction? Or would it be more like online text-based collaboration, in the sense that you can have a back channel for texting in the background of having a synchronous face-to-face discussion, and you have this permanent kind of trace. You have a record. I mean, that's one of the things about Connect, for example, is you can archive those interactions. That's what happens in our flex mode classes. So then it becomes, it's interesting then, because the mode becomes quite complex when you think about what it resembles more. So is the issue more about learning how to collaborate regardless of the circumstance, or is the medium more important? And well, I think it's something we have to sort of think about as we continue in this course. I think the medium rarely stands alone. I think you really have to look at it together with the pedagogical strategies. And there was another thing I wanted to just talk about culture here, and teaching and language learning and languages. In language teaching and learning, we know that language and culture are deeply intertwined, and there are lots of issues which are difficult to do um, online, really. And both teachers and students, we need to remember, have culturally embedded views about, of which they may or may not be aware about the nature of teaching, the nature of learning. That's one of the reasons I get you to talk about those ideas that you have at the beginning and the end of the course, so that we're kind of aware of where we sit as individuals. Um, so, um, so for instance, in universities here, I'll just give an example. One of my doctoral students is working with this program at U of T, because there's such a huge increase in the number of international students. They've instituted a kind of an undergraduate pre-year where they do this whole set of they learn to get a deeper understanding of the language, how teaching and learning operate in the culturally Canadian context, how to write academically in English, and how to become more familiar with the social and cultural aspects of the country, because it's the language is embedded in that. All of our, all language is embedded in culture. So it becomes very challenging to just, you can't just do it by learning the language as a set, in terms of words and things and grammar. And I'm wondering, I think this is going to happen more, but it has interesting implications for the internet and what really can you go and sort of join remotely? I mean, when does that become a cultural barrier or a language barrier, and how do we work in those contexts? I was going to give another example about getting advanced academic degrees online, and I did a lot of research on this a few years ago with a number of grants, looking at online academic apprenticeship for graduate students and particularly doctoral level students, and it was really clear that they were missing, especially if they wanted to be academics in their own, in turn, they were missing so much of the day-to-day academic enculturation experiences that are part of becoming a member of the broader academic community. Very hard to do that stuff online. You're essentially not, because those behaviors are not represented online. They're part of the day-to-day face-to-face interactions that happen. And so, with improving bandwidth and multimedia experience, you can learn more in this environment than you perhaps could when I was doing that research, but a lot's still missing. And I think we're a long way from being able to offer online equivalents for these more complex educational experiences. And another thing about schools and why they might continue longer than you think, or that you might imagine, is that is the role of socialization in our culture. Like, schools have been doing this since the beginning. I mean, it's been a big piece of, and it became more explicit, I think, than perhaps right at the beginning. But now it's definitely a way of being socialized into our culture. And, especially through K to 12. So how do we do that if all education becomes online? Are people willing to give up that ability to make people kind of understand the norms and rules of our society? I mean, I think things are pretty chaotic when you look around globally, and I think you could argue that part of that is perhaps a lack of these things. But the other thing that I worry about in Western countries is that if all education was online and it was really, and then how do you figure out where to go? So if you come from a culturally advantaged background, whether your parents are going to help you sort of, or say, oh, look, there's this wonderful thing over here, you should join into that. But what about people who don't have those kinds of that kind of social capital in their family? And are we it seems to me you could dangerously increase the digital divide there, depending on many things. So I think there are all kinds of wonderful cross-cultural and exciting intellectual community building experiences available, but I don't see them as replacing everything that we're currently engaged in. It's just very complex. The data isn't unequivocal in any way, but I think common sense tells us that people need rich and varied experiences. They need to be comfortable in online contexts, but they also need to be able to navigate learning in all situations, really. And so that's really where perhaps our energy should be. But I think one of the things that I sort of enjoy about thinking about the future of online learning and whether it's actually going to become much more intense is that it makes us really think about, well, what is what are the nuggets that go on in face-to-face education that you really don't want to offload to other sorts of things. So like there are certain kinds of skills that I think are probably quite well learned in a in a shorter period of time in an online setting once people get used to engaging in that sort of space. And they may not even have to be very interactive. I mean, but then there may be other things that you could imagine would be really well done, interacting with communities through using online tools. And that's a pretty unique kind of experience. But then there are things that I think I always come back to my doctoral work with doctoral students. I think it's really hard to do all of that without having some face-to-face FaceTime on these things. It's difficult to talk about research in a meaningful way. It's both a personal and an intellectual complex issue. So I think it's I in somewhere in one of the notes this week I quoted this remark from Tom Carey from a good article which I also put there. That the purpose of adopting online learning should be to free up resources that can be redeployed to preserve and sustain what we value most in higher education, such as mentoring, coaching that enables learners to develop new ways of knowing, doing, and becoming, and being. And I like that. I think that's really something for us to kind of consider, and it forces us to focus on balance and thinking about where we are. So we're now going to go from teaching into learning. And Angela and Jiwoo are going to guide us through the week beginning Tuesday, which is today, and looking at learners and learning in online contexts. How do we help prepare learners to be successful in online settings? And the Lai article sort of talks a bit about this. How do we make the most of the information rich internet sources available to students? That's the sort of the impact of the Quairo article, the import. And how do we help learners and fully understand as teachers ourselves how we navigate the complexity of such contexts to achieve successful kind of learning balance? And Scherblom's work on the juggling of medium, presence, interaction, identity, and relationship is a really good article to frame some of those kinds of issues. So so Angela and Jiwoo will guide us through this, and we will hopefully, I hope you guys are keeping warm, and we'll talk soon. Oh yes, and I did put a couple of other things. This is a I wonder if I can't remember this article. This link may not work, but this one, the new, I have to check that emergent multiliteracies. They took all of that stuff down, which was a shame because it was really cool. But the New York Times article is an interesting one, so you might take a look at that. Okay, so good. I will be talking to you more online this week. Take care.